We have a new project. I will show you how you can make data binding in Angular. In Angular, data binding means that you connect your component class to HTML templates. If you change something in your component, this change will be reflected in HTML template. That is called data binding. There are different kind of data bindings. For example, we see here a HTML string interpolation data binding. For example, we see here a string interpolation data binding. There are also different data bindings. For example, property data binding changes property of an HTML element. For example, I can change property of an image tag by using an attribute from component. I will go to component class and I will define here image URL, and I will use this URL in HTML. For property binding, I defined image URL in component, and I'm binding this. I defined image URL in component, and I bind this only in image source property. I will define this here. If we change, for example, our string interpolation, another example of binding is attribute binding. For example, we can define an area label. For it, the area label is an attribute. For that reason, I am defining this as attribute binding. And I will use like this, and in component you can define your label name. And if we look at this division here, our property binding is there. As we can see, it will be changed here as well. That is attribute binding. We have also class binding. We define a components variable, we call it class binding, and in HTML file we can define this as binding and use this value to activate or deactivate this binding. Let's define this CSS class in CSS. You will set border to 1 pixel and red. We are using class binding. Class binding variable in component is false. If we set this to true, as you can see, we are seeing here a border. That is class binding. Another type of binding is called event binding. We can bind different events. For example, we can define an event binding for buttons like this. As parameter, we also get click event here if you want. You can also use custom events. That is but not required. You can skip this parameter, event parameter. And we need to define my function in our component. We will log this to the console. Let's go to console. If we click on this button, we will see an event output in console. Yes, that is event binding. There is another kind of binding which is called two-way data binding. Let's define a variable. Two-way data binding means that if something changes in view, we will update the model. If something changes in model, the view. For example, my two-way data binding variable is here. It is initial a string. We will go to our HTML again, and we can define here two-way data binding by using banana notation. That means two braces as it is here, and we set our variable which we defined in our components. That will be Engi model. Yes, we see our initial value here. We can also define another paragraph and use string interpolation to output this value interactively to see our two-way data binding. For example, if I change here something, it will be directly changed here as well. That is two-way data binding.